Obese girl was lost in a blizzard for 3 days. Mountain man found her, but the reason will surprise you. The winter of 1793 descended upon the Black Timber Mountains with a ferocity that old-timers would speak of for decades to come. The wind howled through the pines like the wailing of lost souls, and snow fell so thick it turned day into perpetual twilight. In the small settlement of Timber Ridge, nestled at the base of those unforgiving peaks, folks huddled close to their fires and prayed the storm would pass. Mabel Hutchins had lived in Timber Ridge her entire 22 years. She was a large girl, soft-spoken and kind, with rosy cheeks and hands that were always busy sewing, cooking, or gathering medicinal herbs from the mountainside. The townspeople knew her as the one who brought soup to the sick and mended clothes for those too poor to afford new ones. Yet, despite her gentle nature, she lived a lonely existence. Her parents had died of fever 3 winters past, leaving her alone in their small cabin at the edge of town. The night she disappeared, the blizzard struck with biblical fury. Mabel had gone out just before dusk to fetch firewood from the shed, wearing only a thin shawl and her red woolen scarf, a gift from her late mother. When she didn't return within the hour, her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, grew concerned and ventured out to check. She found the woodshed door banging in the wind and Mabel's red scarf tangled in the fence rails, whipping frantically like a flag of distress. Mrs. Patterson raised the alarm, but by then the storm had grown so violent that men could barely stand upright in the wind. Sheriff Coleman gathered what volunteers he could, but after 2 hours of searching in conditions that froze a man's beard solid and turned fingers blue, he called off the search. "No sense losing more lives," he declared grimly. "The girl's gone. May God have mercy on her soul." The town accepted this verdict with sad resignation. Mabel had been well liked, but practical concerns took precedence. In the harsh world of 1790s frontier America, death was an unwelcome but familiar visitor. The blizzard raged on through the night and into the next day, making any rescue attempt suicidal. But high on the mountain, in a cabin hidden among the pines, one man heard the news differently. Elias Ward had not set foot in Timber Ridge for nearly 5 years. He was a figure of legend and speculation, the mountain man who lived like a ghost among the peaks. Some said he was a murderer fleeing justice. Others claimed he'd gone mad with grief after his family perished in a fire. A few insisted he was dead himself, and what people occasionally glimpsed moving through the high timber was merely his restless spirit. The truth, as truths often are, was more complicated. Elias had been a different man once. He'd had a wife, Sarah, and a daughter, little Emma, just 7 years old. They'd lived in town, and Elias had worked as a blacksmith, respected and well regarded. Then came the night a lantern tipped over in their home while Elias was away delivering a repaired wagon. By the time he returned, the house was an inferno. He'd tried to get inside, burning his hands and arms terribly, but the structure collapsed before he could reach them. The town pitied him at first, but grief twisted Elias into someone unrecognizable. He drank heavily, picked fights, and blamed everyone, including himself, for the tragedy. When a traveling preacher suggested that God had taken his family as punishment for some unnamed sin, Elias punched the man and left town that same night. He'd built a cabin high in the mountains and hadn't returned since. Now, 43 years old, Elias lived a solitary existence. He trapped animals for pelts, which he traded once a season with a merchant who made the difficult climb to his cabin. He spoke to no one, trusted no one, and wanted nothing from the world that had stolen everything he loved. But there was one exception to his isolation: Mabel Hutchins. It had started 2 years ago when she'd appeared at his cabin door, breathless from the climb, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. He'd answered with his rifle in hand, suspicious and hostile. "What do you want?" he'd growled. She'd smiled, genuinely smiled, and held out the basket. "I heard you lived up here. Thought you might like some fresh bread and apple preserves. Nobody should live entirely alone." He'd stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language. "I don't need your charity." "It's not charity," she'd replied simply. "It's neighborliness. There's a difference." Before he could respond, she'd set the basket on his porch and started back down the trail. She'd turned once to wave, her round face beaming with warmth, and then she was gone. Elias had stood there for 10 minutes, utterly baffled. When he finally looked in the basket, he found not only bread and preserves, but also a small apple pie, still warm. He'd eaten it alone that night, and for the first time since the fire, he'd wept. Mabel returned every few weeks after that, always bringing food, sometimes mending a torn shirt she'd noticed hanging on his line, never asking for anything in return. She'd chat about town news, about the herbs she was collecting, about nothing in particular. Elias rarely responded with more than a grunt, but he never turned her away. Slowly, against his will and better judgment, he began to look forward to her visits. He never told her that he watched her sometimes from a distance, hidden among the trees as she made her way up the mountain trails collecting herbs. He told himself it was to ensure she didn't get hurt, but deep down he knew the truth. Mabel Hutchins had become the only thread connecting him to humanity, the only reminder that kindness still existed in a world he'd decided was cruel and meaningless. When word reached him through his trader contact that Mabel had vanished in the blizzard, Elias felt something crack inside his chest, a sensation he thought he'd buried with his family. He stood in his cabin, staring at the small shelf where she'd left him things: a preserved jar of jam, a pair of wool socks she'd knitted, a book of poems she thought he might enjoy. The blizzard screamed outside, but inside Elias's mind, a different kind of storm was brewing. The townspeople had given up. Of course they had. Mabel was just a poor, lonely girl to them. She had no family to demand a search, no wealth to make her loss consequential. But to Elias, she was everything. He pulled on his heaviest bearskin coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, loaded his pack with supplies, and stepped into the maelstrom. The blizzard was worse than anything Elias had experienced in 5 years of mountain living. The wind struck like physical blows, and snow fell so thick it was like trying to breathe underwater. Within minutes, his beard was encased in ice, and his eyelashes kept freezing together. But Elias pushed forward with grim determination. He knew these mountains better than anyone alive. Every trail, every rocky outcropping, every cave and shelter, this was his domain. If Mabel was out here, he would find her. He started at her cabin, now buried under snowdrifts. The woodshed door still hung open, banging rhythmically in the wind. Elias examined the area with the practiced eye of a tracker, but the blizzard had erased all traces. He'd have to rely on intuition and knowledge. Mabel often went to the eastern ridge to collect wild ginger and sassafras roots. She'd mentioned it during her visits. That trail led past Miller's Creek, which would be frozen now but treacherous. If she'd been caught out there when the storm hit. Elias set off eastward, fighting through drifts that came up to his thighs. The cold was murderous. Even with his heavy clothing, he could feel it seeping into his bones. His hands, scarred from the fire years ago, ached fiercely in the freezing air. He shouted her name into the wind, knowing it was probably futile. "Mabel! Mabel Hutchins!" The storm swallowed his voice instantly. Hours passed. Elias checked every shelter he knew, rock overhangs, hollow logs, dense thickets that might provide windbreak. Nothing. His lamp oil was running low, and frost had formed on his eyebrows and the inside of his scarf where his breath had frozen. As night fell on the first day, Elias took refuge in a small cave he'd used before. He built a fire with difficulty, his frozen fingers fumbling with flint and steel. As he huddled close to the flames, he thought about Mabel. He remembered the last time she'd visited, just a week before the storm. She'd brought him venison stew in a covered pot, still steaming. "You look thin," she'd said with concern. "Are you eating properly?" "I manage," he'd grunted. She'd ladled stew into his wooden bowl and sat down across from him, uninvited but welcome. "Mr. Ward, can I ask you something?" He'd nodded warily. "Why do you stay up here alone? Don't you miss people?" The question had surprised him. He'd been silent for a long moment before answering. "People let you down. People die and leave you alone. Better to skip the attachment." Mabel had looked at him with those kind eyes and said something that haunted him still. But what if the attachment is what makes us alive? What if the risk of loss is the price we pay for love and it's worth paying? He hadn't known how to respond to that. Eventually, she'd changed the subject, but her words lingered. Now, shivering in the cave as the blizzard raged, Elias realized she'd been right. These past 2 years, her visits had made him feel alive in a way he hadn't since the fire. She'd seen past his scars and his hostility to something worth caring about. She'd never asked him to change or explain himself. She'd simply offered friendship, freely and without conditions, and he'd been too cowardly to tell her what it meant to him. "You're not dead," he said aloud to the darkness. "I won't accept it." Morning brought no relief. If anything, the storm had intensified. Elias forced himself to eat some dried meat and continue his search. Every step was agony. The cold had penetrated deep into his muscles, making movement painful and sluggish. He expanded his search pattern, checking areas further from the usual trails. Maybe Mabel had gotten disoriented and wandered off course. The mountain was full of deadly traps for the unwary cliffs hidden by snow, frozen streams that looked solid but weren't, crevasses that could swallow a person whole. By midday, Elias was beginning to feel the effects of exposure. His thoughts were becoming fuzzy at the edges, and he caught himself stumbling more frequently. He knew the signs of freezing to death. He'd seen men succumb to it before. First came the cold, then the numbness, then the strange warmth and drowsiness that preceded the end. He couldn't stop, not yet. At Miller's Creek, he found something. A scrap of fabric caught on a branch brown homespun, the kind Mabel wore. It was frozen stiff, but it was definitely fresh, not weathered by previous seasons. New energy surged through him. She'd been here. She'd come this direction. Elias followed the creek downstream, reasoning that someone lost would follow water. The ice was treacherous, and twice he fell through into the shockingly cold water below, soaking his legs. Each time, He hauled himself out and kept going, knowing that stopping would mean death. As the short winter day faded to darkness again, Elias was forced to admit he couldn't continue. His body was shutting down. He found another shelter, a thick grove of pines that formed a natural windbreak, and built another fire. As he sat there, watching the flames dance and feeling sensation slowly return to his extremities, despair crept in. What if he was too late? What if Mabel had already succumbed to the cold and he was searching for a corpse? No, he refused to believe it. He thought about the time she'd spoken of her parents, the love and loss in her voice. "They taught me that kindness costs nothing," she'd said once. "The world's hard enough without us making it harder for each other." She'd lived by those words. While the townspeople whispered about her size or her solitary state, Mabel had quietly made life better for everyone around her. She'd tended the sick, fed the hungry, and befriended the friendless, including a bitter, broken man on a mountain who'd given her no encouragement whatsoever. "I don't deserve you," Elias whispered to the fire, "but I'll find you anyway." Dawn of the third day revealed that the storm was finally beginning to weaken. The wind had died to a moderate gale, and the snow had thinned enough that Elias could see more than 10 feet ahead. It wasn't much, but it was something. He was in bad shape. His hands were frost-bitten despite his gloves, his feet were numb blocks of ice, and he'd developed a harsh cough from breathing frozen air. But he was still mobile, still conscious, and still determined. Elias continued following the creek until it bent northward toward a series of rocky hills covered in pine forest. This was rougher country, harder to navigate. If Mabel had made it this far, she would have been exhausted and disoriented. He was about to turn back and try a different area when something caught his eye, an irregularity in the snow beneath a massive pine tree. The snow there was mounded in a way that looked unnatural, as if something underneath had disturbed it before it accumulated. Elias stumbled forward, his heart pounding. He fell to his knees and began digging frantically with his frozen hands, tossing aside armfuls of snow. There, a patch of brown fabric. He dug faster, ignoring the pain in his hands, and then he saw her face. Mabel was curled in a tight ball beneath the tree, her arms wrapped around herself, her lips blue-purple with cold. Snow had drifted over her, creating a natural insulation that might have kept her from freezing solid, but she wasn't moving. "No, no, no, no!" Elias pulled her out of the snow hollow, cradling her against his chest. She was cold, terribly cold, but when he pressed his ear to her chest, he heard it, a heartbeat, faint and slow, but there. She was alive. "Mabel," he shook her gently. "Mabel, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Elias knew he had to act fast. She was in the late stages of hypothermia. He needed to get her warm, and he needed to do it now. His cabin was too far, she'd never survive the journey. But there was a trapper's shelter not far from here, an old stone hut built decades ago. It wasn't much, but it had walls and a roof. He hoisted Mabel onto his back, securing her arms around his neck. She was a substantial weight, but adrenaline gave him strength he didn't know he had left. He staggered through the snow, following a mental map of the terrain, praying his memory was accurate. 20 minutes later, though it felt like hours, he found it. The stone hut was half buried in snow, but the door still opened. Inside, it was barely warmer than outside, but at least there was no wind. Elias laid Mabel on the ground and immediately started gathering any wood he could find, old broken shelves, the remains of a chair, anything burnable. His fingers were so numb he could barely feel them, but he managed to get a fire started in the old stone hearth. As the flames grew, he turned his attention to Mabel. Her clothes were soaked through. He had to get her dry. Working quickly but carefully, he removed her wet outer garments and wrapped her in his own dry bearskin coat and the blanket from his pack. He pulled her close to the fire, positioned himself behind her, and wrapped his arms around her, sharing his body heat. "Come on, Mabel," he murmured. "Stay with me. Don't you dare leave." Minutes crawled by. Elias kept the fire built up high, making the small shelter almost oppressively hot. Gradually, color began to return to Mabel's face. Her breathing deepened. Her body, pressed against his, stopped feeling like ice and began to warm. Then her eyes opened. She looked around in confusion, her gaze finally settling on Elias's face. Elias?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "How—" "Don't talk," he said gruffly. "Save your strength." But she continued to stare at him, her eyes filling with tears. "You came for me." Something broke inside Elias then. All the walls he'd built over 5 years of isolation crumbled. "Of course I came for you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Of course I did." As Mabel's strength slowly returned over the next hour, Elias tended to her with surprising gentleness. He melted snow to give her water, shared his dried meat, and kept the fire burning strong. But he avoided meeting her eyes, as if afraid of what he might reveal. Finally, when she could sit up on her own, Mabel spoke. "Why did you risk your life for me? The whole town gave up. You could have died out there." Elias was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Because for 3 days I was terrified. Terrified that the only person who still sees me as human would vanish from the world." Mabel's eyes widened. "Elias?" But he continued, the words pouring out like water from a broken dam. "Do you remember the first time you brought me food? That apple pie?" She nodded. "I ate it that night, and I cried. I hadn't cried since the fire, hadn't felt anything but anger and grief. But that pie, it tasted like kindness, like someone still thought I deserved something good." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were wet. "For 10 years, everyone's treated me like a monster or a ghost. But you just saw a man who needed a pie." Tears ran down Mabel's cheeks. "You've never been a monster to me." "I didn't search for you out of duty," Elias continued. "Not out of pity. Not because anyone asked me to." He reached out and gently took her hand. "I searched because I needed you to be alive, because you're the only thing that's made me want to be part of the world again." Mabel squeezed his hand, her voice shaking. "I never knew. I thought I was just bothering you with my visits." "Bothering me?" Elias laughed bitterly. "You were the only light in 5 years of darkness. Every time you came up that mountain, I felt a little more alive, a little more like the man I used to be before the fire took everything." "But why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't deserve you," he said simply. "You're good and kind and everything I'm not. I'm just a broken man hiding from his past." Mabel shifted closer to him, still wrapped in his coat. "You're not broken. You're hurt. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes." She looked at him with fierce certainty. "Broken things can't love, but you love, Elias Ward. You loved your wife and daughter. You love these mountains. And I think Maybe you love me too." The words hung in the air between them. Elias felt his heart hammering in his chest. He'd spent so long denying himself any feeling, any connection, believing he didn't deserve it. But looking at Mabel now, this brave, kind woman who'd nearly died in the storm, he couldn't lie. "I do," he whispered. "God help me, I do." Fresh tears spilled down Mabel's face, but she was smiling. "Then you're not broken at all." As the storm continued to weaken outside, Elias and Mabel sat together by the fire, talking in a way they never had before. The barriers were down, the pretenses gone. "Can I ask you something?" Mabel said softly. "Anything." "How did you know where to find me? I never told you about coming to this area." Elias looked uncomfortable. I watched you sometimes, from a distance, when you came up the mountain to gather herbs." "You did?" "I told myself it was to make sure you didn't get hurt. These mountains are dangerous, but the truth is, I just wanted to be near you, even if you didn't know I was there." Rather than being upset, Mabel smiled. "I knew." Elias stared at her in shock. "You what?" "I could feel you watching sometimes. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the trees. At first it startled me, but then I realized it was you." She shook her head fondly. "You weren't as stealthy as you thought. And you weren't afraid." "Of you? Never." She touched his scarred hand gently. "I've seen how carefully you treat the animals you trap, how you leave offerings for the forest spirits, how you helped that injured hawk I found last spring. You thought I didn't notice, but I saw the splint you'd made for its wing." Elias was astounded. "You saw all that?" "I see you, Elias. The real you, not the monster the town imagines, but the man who's been alone too long." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Elias spoke again. "When I heard you were missing, I was angry at the town for giving up so quickly, angry at the storm, angry at myself for not—" He trailed off. "For not what?" "For not telling you sooner how much you meant to me. I thought if I kept my distance, if I didn't acknowledge what I felt, then I couldn't lose you the way I lost Sarah and Emma. But when you disappeared, I realized I'd already lost that battle. You'd gotten past my defenses without even trying." Mabel leaned her head against his shoulder. "Tell me about them. Your family." Elias tensed, then relaxed. For years, he'd refused to speak their names, as if silence could somehow lessen the pain. But now, with Mabel, he found he wanted to remember them aloud. "Sarah was strong," he began slowly. "Not physically, but in spirit. She could face down anything with a smile and a sharp word. Emma was like her mother, fearless, curious, always asking questions." His voice broke slightly. "She would have been 17 now." "I'm sorry you lost them. I blamed myself for years. If I hadn't been out that night, if I'd been home. But Sarah used to say that 'if' was the saddest word in any language. You can't live in the world of 'if.' She was wise. She was." Elias was quiet for a moment. "I think she would have liked you." Mabel looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Really?" "She always said I needed someone who could see through my gruff exterior, someone stubborn enough not to give up on me." He smiled slightly. "You certainly are stubborn." "I prefer persistent," Mabel said with mock indignation, and they both laughed a sound that felt strange and wonderful in the fire-lit shelter. By evening, the blizzard had passed. The wind died to nothing, and through the gaps in the stone walls they could see stars emerging in a clear black sky. The sudden silence was almost eerie after 3 days of constant howling wind. Elias checked Mabel carefully. Her color was good now, her breathing normal. She'd been incredibly lucky the hollow under the pine tree had protected her from the worst of the wind, and her body's natural insulation had kept her core temperature just high enough to survive. But she was weak and would need rest before attempting the journey down the mountain. "We'll stay here tonight," Elias decided. "In the morning, we'll make our way to my cabin. It's closer than town, and you need proper rest before we attempt the descent." Mabel nodded, then hesitated. "The town, they think I'm dead, don't they?" "Probably. And when we show up alive, everyone will want to know what happened, where we were." She looked at him meaningfully. "They'll ask questions." Elias understood what she wasn't saying. "And you're worried about your reputation, spending days alone with me." "I don't care about my reputation," Mabel said firmly, "but I care about yours. If people think they'll say cruel things about you." "They already say cruel things about me. But now they'll have an excuse to be worse." She bit her lip. "Maybe I should say I found shelter on my own, and you just happened to discover me." "No." Elias's voice was hard. "No more hiding. I'm tired of living like a ghost. If I have to come down from this mountain and face the town to be with you, then that's what I'll do." "Elias, I mean it, Mabel. I've spent 10 years running from life because I was afraid to hurt again. But these last 3 days taught me something. The pain of losing you, even just the possibility of it, was worse than the pain of the fire, because this time I would have known what I was losing before it was gone." He took both her hands in his scarred ones. "When you disappeared, I wasn't afraid for myself. I was afraid that I'd never get to tell you that you saved me. Not from the fire, from the aftermath, from the man I was becoming." Mabel was crying again, but smiling through her tears. "I didn't do anything special." "You did everything. You saw me. You refused to let me disappear into my grief. You just kept showing up with your pies and your kindness and your absolute refusal to believe I was beyond redemption." He squeezed her hands gently. "You were right that day when you asked if attachment was what makes us alive. It is. You are, and I'm done pretending otherwise." "So what do we do?" Mabel asked. "We go down the mountain together. We tell the truth that I found you, that I kept you alive, that we survived the storm, and then—" He paused, suddenly uncertain. "If you'll have me, I'd like to court you properly. Not hiding anymore, not watching from the trees, actually being part of your life." "I'd like that," Mabel whispered. "I'd like that very much." They held each other close as the fire burned low, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely way, in the most unlikely place. Morning broke crystal clear and blindingly bright. The sun reflected off fresh snow, turning the landscape into a sea of diamonds. Elias helped Mabel to her feet, supporting her as she tested her strength. "How do you feel?" "Sore, tired, but alive." She smiled at him. "Thanks to you." They made their way slowly toward Elias's cabin, taking frequent rests. The journey that would normally take an hour stretched to 3, but Elias didn't rush her. They talked as they walked about everything and nothing, about the mountains and the town, about memories and dreams, about the future they might build together. When they finally reached his cabin, Mabel looked around with curious eyes. It was sparse, but well-maintained, a single room with a bed, a table, a chair, and the shelves where he kept her gifts. "It's not much," Elias said, suddenly self-conscious. "It's honest," Mabel replied. Like you? He built up the fire while she rested on his bed, the first time anyone else had lain there since he'd built the cabin. Watching her there felt right in a way that made his chest ache. Elias? She called softly. Yes? When we go down to town tomorrow, they're going to be shocked. Let them be shocked. Some of them will be angry that you're still alive. They'll dredge up the old stories about the fire, about why you left. I know. It won't be easy. Elias came to sit beside her on the bed. Nothing worth having ever is, but I'm tired of being easy. I'm tired of being alone, and I'm tired of being afraid. He stroked her hair gently. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. Mabel took his hand and placed it over her heart. Together, she agreed. They spent the rest of that day in peaceful contentment, talking and resting, preparing for the challenges ahead. As night fell, Elias made them both tea from the herbs Mabel had taught him to recognize during her visits. You know, she said, sipping the tea, I used to worry that you were too isolated up here, that you needed people. I did need people, Elias said. I just needed the right person. The rest of them I can take or leave. She laughed. You'll need to work on your social skills if we're going to convince the town we're not both crazy. Are we crazy? Probably, Mabel admitted cheerfully. But I've always thought the best kind of people are a little bit mad. The next morning, they began the journey down to Timber Ridge. Mabel was still weak, so progress was slow. Elias stayed close, ready to catch her if she stumbled. As they descended, he found himself growing nervous in a way he hadn't expected. What if they're right? He said suddenly. Right about what? About me? What if I'm not good enough for you? What if I can't adjust to living around people again? What if... Elias! Mabel stopped walking and turned to face him. Remember what your Sarah said? If is the saddest word in any language. You can't live in the world of if. He smiled despite himself. Using my own words against me? Using wise words, wherever they come from? She touched his face gently. We'll figure it out together. That's what matters. As they approached the outskirts of town, they saw a figure chopping wood, old Mr. Henshaw, who'd lived in Timber Ridge longer than anyone. He looked up at the sound of their footsteps, and his axe fell from his hands with a thud. Mabel, he whispered, Lord have mercy, child, we thought you were dead. Within minutes, it seemed the entire town had materialized. People rushed out of houses and shops, calling Mabel's name, asking questions, expressing amazement. Sheriff Coleman pushed through the crowd, his eyes wide. Miss Hutchins, how in God's name? Then his gaze fell on Elias, and his expression hardened. Ward, should have known you'd be involved in this somehow. He saved my life, Mabel said firmly, before the sheriff could continue. I got lost in the blizzard, and Mr. Ward spent 3 days searching for me in conditions that should have killed him. Without him, I'd be dead. The crowd murmured, uncertain how to react. Some looked at Elias with new respect, others with continued suspicion. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her eyes full of tears. Oh, Mabel, dear, we prayed for you, but we never thought. She embraced the younger woman tightly. Mr. Ward wouldn't give up, Mabel said, loud enough for everyone to hear. When everyone else had accepted that I was gone, he went out into that storm and risked everything to find me. He's a hero. Hero's a strong word, muttered someone in the crowd. Is it? Mabel looked around at all of them. How many of you went looking for me after the first day? How many of you were willing to risk your lives? uncomfortable silence fell. Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat. "Well now, Miss Hutchins, that's not entirely fair. The conditions were—" "The conditions were the same for everyone," Mabel interrupted, "but only one man cared enough to face them anyway." Elias shifted uncomfortably under the attention. "I just did what needed doing." "No," Mabel said, looking at him with such open affection that several people gasped. "You did what no one else would do, and I'm grateful, more grateful than I can ever express." The crowd began to disperse slowly, still murmuring among themselves. Some offered congratulations. Others hurried away to spread the gossip. But as they left, Elias noticed that some of the looks directed at him were different, now less fearful, more curious. "Mrs. Patterson insisted that Mabel come stay with her for a few days to recover properly." As the older woman led her away, Mabel looked back at Elias, mouthing the words, "I'll see you soon." He nodded, feeling strangely bereft without her nearby. Sheriff Coleman approached him, his expression unreadable. "That was quite a thing you did, Ward, I suppose. Look, I'll be straight with you. I never believed all those stories about you being dangerous, but I also never thought you'd come back down here." He extended his hand. "Thank you for bringing her back." Elias stared at the offered hand for a moment, then shook it. "I didn't do it for thanks." "I know, but you have it anyway." The sheriff paused. "If you're thinking about staying in town instead of heading back up to your cabin, well, we could use a blacksmith. Ours died last winter, and we've been making do." Elias was stunned. "You're offering me work?" "I'm offering you a chance to be part of this community again if you want it. Can't promise everyone will welcome you with open arms, but after what you did, people might be willing to give you another chance." After the sheriff left, Elias stood alone in the street, looking around at Timber Ridge. It looked the same as it had 10 years ago, but he felt different. The anger and bitterness that had driven him away felt less overwhelming now, tempered by something he'd thought was lost to him forever: hope. Over the next few weeks, Timber Ridge slowly adjusted to the return of Elias Ward. Some remained suspicious, but most people were willing to let the past stay in the past. The story of his rescue of Mabel spread, growing more dramatic with each retelling, until he became something of a reluctant legend. Elias took over the old blacksmith shop, finding that his hand still remembered the work despite the years. It was strange at first, being around people again, hearing the constant chatter and bustle of town life. But Mabel visited him every day, bringing lunch and conversation, and her presence made it bearable. One afternoon, as he worked on repairing a plow blade, she arrived with her basket and a mischievous smile. "I have something for you," she announced. "Oh?" She pulled back the cloth to reveal an apple pie still steaming. "Like the first one I brought you, remember?" Elias set down his hammer and came to her, wiping soot from his hands. "I remember everything about that day. Do you remember what you thought when I showed up at your cabin?" "I thought you were either very brave or very foolish." "And which was I?" He pulled her close, not caring who might see through the shop window. "Both, and perfect." They kissed then, properly, for the first time. When they finally pulled apart, Mabel was blushing furiously, but she was also grinning. "The whole town's going to know about this by dinner time," she said. "Good, let them know." "Elias Ward, are you actually courting me publicly?" "I am, unless you object." "I don't object at all." She kissed him again, quick and sweet, though I have to say, your courting technique could use some work. Most men bring flowers, not near-death experiences in blizzards." He laughed a sound that still felt new and strange, but increasingly natural. "I'll try to be more conventional in the future." "Don't you dare! I didn't fall in love with a conventional man." Elias froze. "Love?" Mabel met his eyes steadily. "Yes, love. I've loved you since you spent 3 days in a blizzard refusing to believe I was dead. Maybe even before that. Is that all right?" Instead of answering with words, Elias showed her. He kissed her, with 10 years of loneliness and loss behind it, with hope and gratitude and wonder. When they finally broke apart, both of them were crying. "I love you too," he whispered against her hair. "God help me, I love you more than I thought I could love anything again." They stood there in the blacksmith shop, holding each other, while outside the town went about its business. And somewhere in the mountains, spring was beginning to break through the winter snow. Months later, when Elias and Mabel married in the small church at Timber Ridge, the whole town attended. Some came out of genuine happiness for the couple, others out of curiosity. But as Elias looked at Mabel in her simple wedding dress, her face radiant with joy, he didn't care about their reasons. He'd gone into a blizzard expecting to find death, and instead he'd found life. He'd gone searching for a lost girl and found himself in the process. And while he'd told everyone he searched for Mabel to save her, the truth, which only the two of them fully understood, was that she'd been saving him all along. As they stood together, beginning their new life as husband and wife, Elias sent a silent thanks to the blizzard that had brought them together, to the stubborn kindness that had kept her visiting him for 2 years, and to the love that had proven stronger than grief, loneliness, and the worst storm the Black Timber Mountains had ever seen. He'd spent 10 years hiding from the world, convinced he didn't deserve happiness. But Mabel had refused to accept that. She'd climbed his mountain, knocked on his door, and quietly, persistently, loved him back to life. And that, more than any rescue in a blizzard, was the real miracle.